The history of the Rx-7 is rather complicated and somewhat tragic considering the last rotary-powered car released by Mazda was in 2012, and quite frankly, it was terrible. So let's start from the beginning. In 1929, a German engineer named Felix Wankel patented the first Wankel rotary engine. It wasn't until 1959 that a working prototype was designed. The concept behind the engine was simple. As the rotor spins, the spark plug ignites the air-fuel mixture created by the spinning rotor, which then creates pressure, which then pushes the rotor to move further. This newly designed engine was lightweight, compact, and it had a relatively low cost. Just a few years after the official prototype of the rotary engine was released, Mazda signed a contract with NSU allowing the use of the engine on future production vehicles. Mazda knew the rotary engine had its issues, and in order to improve it, they started the Rotary Engine Research Development Department in 1963. Mazda improved the design of the Wankel rotary engine, and it became the first company to use the dual rotor engine in an automobile with the release of the Cosmo Sport in 1967. The car was stylish, sporty, and powerful. The success of the Cosmo led into the mid-1970s, but this is when Mazda decided to create something more sporty, more stylish, and faster than the previous generation of Cosmo. It kinda worked. In 1978, the FB Rx-7 was released. It replaced the Mazda Cosmo, and the vehicle performed fairly well. Because of the small displacement size of the Wankel rotary engine, Japanese citizens did not have to pay yearly taxes for driving a larger car. Despite the small engine size of the Rx-7, it still offered more power than your typical inline four-cylinder engine. The engineering behind the FB Rx-7 was fairly impressive. The car had a near 50-50 weight distribution, and it produced a whopping 110 horsepower. This might not seem like a lot today, but back in 1978, this was quite a bit of power. In September of 1983, Mazda released a turbocharged model in Japan. This wasn't Mazda's first turbocharged rotary engine. The Mazda Cosmo I mentioned before had a turbocharged model that was only released in Japan in 1982. The turbocharged Rx-7 produced 163 horsepower and accelerated from 0 to 60 in only 6.4 seconds. Unfortunately, this car was only released in Japan, so if you really wanted one, you would have had to import one, and the exact production numbers are unknown, but enthusiasts believe there are around 2,000 of these vehicles produced. After the moderate success of the first-gen Rx-7, Mazda decided to make something faster, more powerful, and more luxurious. In 1985, Mazda released the FC Rx-7. Many improvements were made to the first generation of Rx-7. The vehicle handled significantly better, independent rear suspension was added, steering was more precise, disc brakes became standard, and most importantly, the FC Rx-7 had more power. Not only was this generation of Rx-7 more powerful than its predecessor, the car was modernized, and in my opinion, the FC looks significantly better than the first generation. Mazda wanted to design a car that appealed to the American market. This was where the majority of first-gen sales were. The FC Rx-7 was designed to be a direct competitor to the Porsche 944 and Dodge Daytona. Additionally, the car came with a brand new engine. The second generation Rx-7 came with a 12A engine, which was a fuel-injected 1.3-liter twin-rotor engine producing 146 horsepower. The car weighed 2,696 pounds, which is almost 400 pounds heavier than the first generation. However, this was justified by the vehicle's performance. The FC was designed to be a more luxurious tour vehicle because that was what was popular in the United States during the 1980s. In 1987, Mazda offered a turbocharged model called the Turbo 2. The Turbo 2 produced 182 horsepower, and the car accelerated from 0 to 60 in just 6.4 seconds. The turbocharged model is by far the most sought-after FC Rx-7 to this day, and rightfully so. Mazda was seeking perfection with the Rx-7 lineup, so in 1989, Mazda released the Series 5 FC Rx-7. The Series 5 brought many improvements to the FC chassis. The styling was updated, the vehicle had better engine management, as well as a lighter rotors and a higher compression ratio. All these improvements meant that the naturally aspirated Rx-7 was now making 160 horsepower, and the turbo model now made 200 horsepower. In 1988, 10 years after the first generation Rx-7 debuted, Mazda released the 10th anniversary car to celebrate the car being 10 years old. This was a limited production model based off of the Turbo 2, and only 1,500 units were made. This car came in crystal white with a black leather interior and a leather-wrapped Momo steering wheel and shift shift knob. I think my favorite thing about this car is the bronze tinted windows. All exterior glass is bronze tinted, and it's such a subtle detail, but it really brings the whole car together. 1 year after the 10-year anniversary car, Mazda released the FC GTU trim model. Spec was released after the success of the FC Rx-7 in international motorsports. The GTU used the lightweight base model, which came with manual windows, no rear wiper, and the sunroof and AC was a dealer option. Several performance parts from the turbo model were added, including 4-piston brakes, ventilated rear brake rotors, and vehicle speed sensing power steering. This is the rarest FC Rx-7 as the amount produced is unknown. Enthusiasts speculate that Mazda only sold a few hundred, but there have not been 100 of these models found and registered. The GTU is definitely an interesting part of the FC's history. After 250,000 were produced, the world said goodbye to the FC Rx-7. The 80s were over. It is now 1992 and Mazda just released the 3rd generation Series 6 FD Rx-7. The car was new and it was unique. Instead of sharing the sharp edges and lines of the FC, the FD Rx-7 was curvy and sleek. On top of looking absolutely amazing, the FD came standard with a 13B REW sequentially turbocharged engine. This new engine boosted power to 252 horsepower. The sequential turbocharger was something unseen from the Japanese market, and it was extremely complex, so much so that Mazda developed it in partnership with Hitachi. The sequential turbo system allowed for smoother acceleration and for the most part eliminated any turbo lag. The smaller turbocharger would spool up at lower RPMs, allowing more low-end torque, while the larger one would kick in above 4,000 RPM. This worked fairly well because the car only took 5.4 seconds to reach 60 miles an hour. To put that into perspective, that's faster than the Honda NSX of the same time. The FD was 2,685 pounds and had a near perfect 50-50 weight distribution. This car certainly handled well and dominated in motorsports. In 1995, Mazda produced the Mazda Rx-7 SP, which was designed for racing. The SP was designed by Mazda to race in the Australian GT production car series and the Eastern Creek 12-hour production car race. Only 35 cars were made, and these cars were nothing short of impressive. The Rx-7 SP was rated at a whopping 273 horsepower, and it featured a race-developed carbon fiber nose cone and a rear spoiler, a carbon fiber fuel tank, 17-inch wheels, larger brake rotors and calipers, 3 times more efficient intercooler, a new exhaust, and Recaro race seats. This paid off because the Rx-7 won the 1995 Eastern Creek 12-hour, giving Mazda the winning 12-hour trophy for the 4th straight year. Minor changes to the car were made in 1996. Most notably, the car was no longer sold in the United States because it failed to meet emission regulation. The FD was still sold from 1995 to 1998, and as sales fell, the now Series 8 Rx-7 was exclusively sold in Japan. Japanese exclusive vehicles had more efficient turbochargers, which improved intercooling. The seats, the steering wheel, and instrument clusters were all changed. The rear spoiler was modified and gained adjustability on certain models. Mazda even released a Spirit R trim model that featured all the extra features Mazda had used on previous limited run specials, but added cross-drilled brake rotors. This car was pretty amazing, and it's definitely a sought-after vehicle. In 2002, production of the Rx-7 ended. Since then, Mazda has never made a rotary-powered sports car just like the Rx-7. They tried with the Rx-8, but this just didn't work out. Mazda was struggling to meet US emission regulations, which is not an easy thing to do with a rotary engine. As a result, the Rx-8 had to be tuned down, and it just did not boast the same performance as the FD Rx-7. It's unsure where the Rx name is going, but it's likely that we will see a hybrid power rotor sports car sometime in the near future.